one of my key interests, well, first of all, welcome everybody. And because these are such fast sessions, I feel like it's great because no one will know, there won't be the chance to, hopefully, to get bored. So we'll try and do everything, tell you the whole Torah on one foot. So one of my key interests over the past 20 years or so, 20, 25 years or so, has been globalization. And the way that globalization has affected all of our lives, especially in what you call the global south, what used to be called the developing world or the third world. You never can find exactly the right word for it, the two-thirds world. I've traveled in many, many places. I started as a reporter in Ethiopia. I'm also a rabbi, but I started as a reporter in Ethiopia and traveled to many places in East Africa, Somalia, Kenya, then back to Asia, India, Nepal, Burma, all kinds of places. And during that whole period, I was very interested in what was happening in the world at the time of what I would call fast-track globalization. Right after I started in Ethiopia in 1990, right when the wall fell and the Soviet Union crumbled and the end of history, if you remember that essay by Francis Fukuyama, now there's a triumph of neoliberal capitalism, and I was very, very interested in what is happening to the majority of the population in countries, in the poorer countries, in the countries that were colonized by the West, and we're in this post-colonial era, and we're now facing a new kind of integration into the world called economic globalization. Now, there's all kinds of globalization has many different aspects to it. There's also an aspect to globalization of spreading values, for example. So, for example, feminism is a global phenomenon spread through globalization. Human rights, there are all kinds of, I think, mostly positive things that are also spread. There's the programs of the World Health Organization that have saved untold millions of lives. But today, what I'm concentrating on and focusing on is what's called economic globalization, and on the gigantic impact of economic globalization on the world, and an attempt to try to understand what we, as Jews, what do we have to say if the world is being remade? Now, I know that in certain ways now there's a reaction and a response against globalization. There's Trump, there's Brexit, and yet still the mechanisms of globalization, the World Trade Organization, many different kinds of ways that the world is operating, basically, are still really very, very strongly in place, even though there is this reaction against it. And that's the first thing that I came to understand, and that's important for me. Perhaps you all know it already, but it's important for me to emphasize, is that economic globalization is not something that proceeds kind of in a natural way. It just sort of happened. It just sort of happened that way. Sort of free trade, free, open, sort of this is what happens when things are natural. No, economic globalization has an idea behind it. It has certain actors that are pushing it very strongly, and it has its own internal logic and serving specific needs, and in fact was moved in a certain kind of way, founded on a certain concept of what is human life, what are we, who are we? And in that sense, it is very relevant to ask ourselves, what do we have as Jews? And we're carrying this Jewish tradition with us for so long, so many years, so many centuries, this Jewish tradition of social justice, of the Torah, of the prophets, of the understanding that our sages came to. What do we have to say when we are basically creating the world anew and weaving the world together in a way that has never been done before? Because make no mistake about it, that is what is happening and what has been happening. So as I said, I saw this process of globalization happening before my eyes. The first thing I wrote about it was I started to sort of meditate on the Thai workers in the Arava. I don't know if you guys know, but there are more Thai workers in the Arava than there are Israelis in the Arava. And I went down and started, first of all, why are there Thai workers in the Arava? So it turns out that, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, most of Israeli agriculture 80% of Israeli agriculture was for Israel. Now, 80% of Israeli agriculture is for export. And to create these perfect peppers that have to compete with the peppers coming from Morocco or coming from Portugal or coming from somewhere else that might have cheaper labor, you really have to have a labor force that can work very intensely with not very much money, thus the Thais. Now, when I went down there, I discovered that all these Thais come from a certain area in Thailand. They don't come just from Thailand. They come from, anyone know? An area in northern Thailand, or northeastern Thailand called Isan, which is the poorest area of Thailand. It used to be part of Laos. They were Lao people. It was given to Thailand by the French in like 1900. And basically the Isan people there, they made their living from fishing and hunting and one rice crop a year. Now what happened was that in the 1970s, I hope you can follow this story, there was a big push by the United States and Europe to lend money. A lot of money came into the United States, and here we have a small part of the story, because after the Yom Kippur War, there was the oil embargo, if you remember. Oil prices shot up. The Arab states took their money, this huge amounts of money they made, they parked it in the United States. The United States, the banks were very interested in sending that money out so they could get at least some interest, so they pushed these low interest loans to countries like Thailand and said to them, take these loans, you're going to develop, you're going to be like us, you're going to make a lot of money, and they sent these loans out. But then when Reagan came in, the interest rates shot up. America wanted money back in again. The interest rates shot up. People couldn't pay their loans anymore. But anyway, in the meantime, in order to pay back these loans, so you had to pay them back, you couldn't pay them back in Thai baht. You had to pay them back in dollars. So how do you get dollars? You need to manufacture things, either grow things or manufacture things cheaply that you can sell to the West. So how do you manufacture things? What do you need to manufacture things? What do you need for factories? You need workers, and what else do you need? Capital, that they got from the loans, and electricity. How do you get electricity? You dam up the rivers. When you dam up the rivers, there's no fishing anymore, and this entire population basically is on the move, migrating either to Bangkok or to the other big cities in Thailand, or some Israeli landed in Thailand by mistake, this guy, and he started the whole movement of bringing Thai workers to Israel for agriculture. So there's this kind of circle of globalization that happens, and that is not necessarily to the benefit or to the benefit or through the choice of the people that it's happening to. So, like I said, the centrality of this process of globalization, which I saw really affecting lives everywhere, especially the lives of people who were moving from villages, moving from still at that time 70, 80% of the population, 80%, now it's about 70%, were living in rural villages. So they're being pressured to leave. Their way of life is ending. They can't make it anymore. What's happening to them? My question was, what can we learn from the Jewish tradition in terms of this new world that's happening? What kind of world do we want? What do we want it to be rich or to be poor? What do we want the lowest saf, the lowest, level of acceptability in human life to be like? How are we going to set what kind of world we want? I mean, it seemed to me almost in a certain way, globalization is almost a messianic thing, because for so long, the prophets have been predicting that all of humanity is going to be in a one world. But how can we really infuse it with that energy of goodness that we want there to be in this unified humanity? So there's two things we have to do. We have to understand, to do this, to try to do this process of understanding both what we have to say. We have to understand, in other words, we have to understand what the Torah can say. We have to translate what it's saying into the terms that make sense today. And we have to ponder and understand the world as it is. And then we have to bring those two things together. So I want to start, first of all, with what is globalization? When I said that it's very specific. So what happened was that when Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl took over in 1980, and then 8 years later, the Berlin Wall fell and communism started to dissipate, this push for globalization took place under the star of what you call neoliberal economics, which still is more or less the hegemonist, controlling kind of economics that has created and continues to create the world economy. Now, neoliberal economics is based on a reading of Adam Smith, the sort of ur-text of capitalism, that basically says that human beings are motivated mostly by their own self-interest, and that their own self-interest, which is fine, for me that's fine, but that their own self-interest is mostly about gaining profit. So neoliberal globalization has, I think, a very one-dimensional reading of Adam Smith, but basically takes this idea and says that if human beings are, that if our main motivation is personal greed or self-interest, then everything private is more efficient than everything public. That what we have to do if we're going to create a good economy is to deregulate as much as we can. And a good economy means something that's growing all the time. Growing because that is the only thing that can serve the needs and the motivations of people that want to make more and more profit. So we need to grow in all kinds of ways. Now what happened is that this all might be very fine and good in the time of Adam Smith, maybe, because there he's talking about private people. But what happened is this neoliberal ideology collided with the fact that the main economic actors are not human beings, but are corporations. Corporations, artificial human beings, legal persons, artificial persons, whatever you want to call them, that have tremendous strength, and in this process gain tremendous strength, going from being limited in terms of their size, in terms of what they can do, in terms of their region, through the globalization process to a point where they can go anywhere in the world, and anyone who's signed on the World Trade Organization has to let them in at the same kind of terms as their own local companies. So this process of growth driving globalization, and of course driving globalization because in order to grow and to continue to keep growing, you need natural resources, which are all over the world. You need a cheap labor force, and you need more and more consumers. So here, I won't go into all the details, but here you have, I think, an interesting list of what happens in the globalization process, in the corporate-led globalization process. Now, since things are so tight, and yes? What? No, but people, I hope, can share. Okay, so now I want to get to the Torah. So I put over my, sort of a banner that I like to think about these things. There's someone named Norman Gottwald, who was a biblical scholar, still alive. he wrote the following. He wrote, "We are left with the logically perplexing but morally empowering paradox that the Torah is both grossly irrelevant in direct application to current economic problems and incredibly relevant in vision and principle for grasping opportunities and obligations to make the whole earth and its bounty serve the welfare of the whole human family." In other words, the delicate process that we have to do, I think, is to be able to not to say, okay, one-on-one, the Jubilee year, now we're going to enforce the Jubilee year as it was, or the sabbatical year, or even to say, the Torah forbids all kinds of interest, we're now going to forbid all kinds of interest, but to take those principles and to understand how they can be applied in the global world. And I came to the conclusion that, in fact, if you take the narrative part of the Torah, that the narrative part of the Torah, a very strong spine within it. There are other themes obviously within it, but a very strong spine is exactly about the question of economic justice. That if you look at the story of human history, emerging from Gan Eden, where clearly one reading of the Gan Eden story, one strong reading of the Gan Eden story, is that it's an emergence of human beings from the hunter-gatherer period to agriculture. They're naked before, they're eating from all the fruits of the trees. Afterwards, they're eating bread by the sweat of their brow, bread meaning staple food, characteristic of agriculture. What happens with agriculture is, for the first time, there's hierarchy. And for the first time, you can create a culture that is based on not just on everyone doing the same thing, but because you can make enough, create enough harvest to store food, so certain people can become a higher part of the hierarchy. You can have kings, you can have craftsmen, you can have military, etc., etc. Now that's all fine, all very, very, are very good, but what happens in the rest of Bereshit, especially the last third of Bereshit, is basically the Joseph story, where the Joseph story has many aspects to it as well, but one very strong aspect is how the storage of food, although leading to saving the people from famine, also concentrates all the wealth in the hands of Pharaoh. If you know the part after Joseph and Yehuda and all that part, where the people sell everything they have in order to get the grain. And they say we are now slaves to Pharaoh. And that slavery, to me, is the beginning of the story of slavery for the Jewish people. By the end, the Jewish people are making these bricks for food storehouses, giant storages of food, the first kind of capital, that indeed Egypt was where their power came from, these gigantic storehouses of food. That is how they had their international clout and the richness of their civilization. Now what happens after they leave Egypt? What's the economy of the desert? The economy of the desert is the manna. And what does the Torah say about the manna? What's the miraculous thing about the manna? I don't mean the midrash about how it tastes like everything you want, which we all love that midrash, but
it's not stored.
It cannot be stored. It cannot be stored overnight even, and in fact, you cannot, no matter how much you try, you can't gather more than you need for each day, which is Omer la Gilgolet, one Omer. And in fact, that Omer is then put in as a maskeret, zikaron, into the Aron HaKodesh and kept there. It's really the only thing the Torah tells us besides the tablets that's in the Aron HaKodesh, is as if to remind us that at the center of our Torah, at the central spiritual symbol of our Torah is what each person needs to eat every day. Now, what I see is that many of the Torah's laws, of course we can't go into them because we have like 2 seconds left, but from the prohibition against interest, which like the manna means that the money can't, value doesn't, you can't store it and add its value all the time. You can't. Of course, the Jubilee, which redivides the land according to need, according to the families, which was originally divided according to need. And by the way, the prophet Yechezkel said that also non-Jews who are resident in the land of Israel also should get, he had a revelation that they should also be part of this redivision. The mitzvah to lend money to the poor, all kinds of prohibition against oppression of workers, all, I think, lead back to this juxtaposition between Manna and Egypt. And I think at the root of it is both the idea of God's ownership of land, really God's ownership of the earth, and that everything we have is really only a partial ownership. There's no absolute ownership. And also the idea that human need comes before it trumps ownership. So if you look at this pasuk over here, right after the giving of the Torah, so it says, if you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you shall return it to him when the sun goes down. In other words, something that he wears at night. Why? For it is his only covering. It is garment for his skin. Wherein shall he sleep? Or in Hebrew, he simlato le'oro b'meh yishkav. And to me, the fact that you don't need anything else. The Torah doesn't need to say anything else. B'meh yishkav, iksuto le'oro b'meh yishkav. The covering, the fact that he has skin and then he needs to cover it, that is beyond any sense of ownership through that which we run our economy. There's been, I have a few quotes over here. I think that in the years between the wars, especially, there was a very growing awareness before the Holocaust of an emergence of a connection between Jewish thinkers, Orthodox Jewish thinkers, and large ideas, macroeconomic ideas. So you have someone like Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, Haredi, totally Haredi, living in the middle of Mea Shearim, who is one of the great Kabbalists of the 20th century. And he says, and it should not seem strange that I connect the welfare of one group to peace in the entire world, because the truth is that we've already reached the kind of level in which the whole world is to be thought of as one group and one society. That is to say that each individual in the world, inasmuch as he draws the juice of his life and his needs from all the people of the world, he says, I think, L'shad HaChayim, we draw our L'shad HaChayim from all the people of the world as a whole, thus becomes responsible to serve and be concerned about the world in its entirety. So I would say that the fight that we as religious Jews, that what we have to bring into the arena is our commitment to a struggle for an economy of the common good, an economy that recognizes that the common good of individuals and the basic needs of human beings is something that, as I said before, trumps or overcomes any kind of value of, that overcomes the market. That you have a place for the market, but the market must be held within a larger framework of common good. We see this even in halachot that are brought down in Shulchan Aruch. For example, the halachot in Shulchan Aruch say, in Shulchan Aruch, mamash, in Choshen Mishpat, I have it here in Choshen Mishpat, Reish Lamed Aleph, it says that things that are basic foodstuffs should not be part of a commercial marketplace. That they should that they should be sold. Farmers should sell directly to the consumers. That people are not, middlemen are not allowed to make money from basic foodstuffs. Now again, I'm not saying that that's what we should do, that's the best thing, but what it does say, what it does point out is that basic human needs come before ideas of free market or any other economic ideas that we might have. Now, I closed in my sheet over here with something that's on a different tack, the Maharal, and I'll just end with this, that I think that socialist ideas until now, and I'm not saying that what I'm advocating is a form of socialism, it may be much more communal based, but have ignored, I think that their big problem has been ignoring the individual, and I think that's the other side that Judaism has to bring, is the deep appreciation for the uniqueness of each individual, and that's what we have to integrate with this larger ideas of of common good. So there's a lot of work to do, and there's more to see on the sheet that I didn't get to. So, thank you.